A very good evening to all of you, and welcome to uh, the seventh in our series of monthly lectures and dialogues. The effort of the NIUA dialogue series has been to try and engage with current issues to do with urbanization in India, as well as the urban sector and the kinds of forms it is beginning to take, and what could be initiatives by the Government of India and other stakeholders, more importantly, I would say, in supporting a more purposeful and a more sustainable form and pattern of urbanization in India. And each of these lectures contributes a wonderful new aspect to this, and this evening is not going to be any different. We have with us two very eminent professionals from the urban space, as well as the broader space in which urban concerns are located. Our lead speaker for this evening is Ireena Vittal. We have we have the great honor of having Ireena with us. She's one of the advisors on a seminal study that was brought out by the McKinsey Global Institute, known as India's Urban Awakening, now almost a standard reference from parliamentarians down to students of urbanization. And she was one of the key advisors on that knowledge product. Besides that, Ireena has many other engagements. To her credit, we have already circulated the profiles of our two discussants, so I won't go into greater length about that. But I think it's important to note that we have in our midst today someone who might have possibly coined that wonderful image of India needing to build one Chicago every year, for the next many years. And perhaps, I don't know, but perhaps Ireena was behind that kind of articulation. But essentially, it has fired up the imagination of the entire urban sector in this country about both the challenges ahead of us as well as possible pathways to dealing with this. Raghu Ramaswamy, the discussant for this evening, is also a seasoned professional. He, till quite recently, was heading the company known as IDEC in Karnataka, a joint venture between the government of Karnataka and IDFC. Has 20 years plus of experience in the urban sector, and has now chosen to join the world of academia and research, and is director of various portfolios at the Rix School of Built Environment in Amity University in NOIDA. So we are going to look forward to an extremely lively set of presentations and discussions and your interventions as well. So with that, let me invite Ireena Vittal to deliver her lecture. Ireena, thanks.
Thank you for being here on a cold and wet day. I am trying to get this up. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and I'm going to take you through some thoughts on India's urban growth. Can integrated planning and smart thinking make it happen? This is really in three parts. One is, what is the value at stake? Why should we bother about India's cities? And the reason I'm taking you through this is referring to the work that the McKinsey Global Institute did. The context of it was the MGI, as it's known, had done a similar piece of work for China, and it took them about a year and a half to put the whole case together. And when we started working in India, we said, McKinsey has done this in China, we'll do it in a year. And it took us 3 years. And the reason was because we found out the first big difference between China and India was there was no case for urbanization. In India, whether it was the politicians, in some cases the bureaucrats, there was almost a false choice about urban versus rural. And so I make it a point to make sure that we all start off by saying, why do cities matter, and why should we continue to focus on them, even as we do a whole bunch of other things for rural India, and why that's not the choice. The second thing I'm going to talk to you about is what is needed to fix the cities. And the third one, which is perhaps the most important, is how on earth will we make it happen? So let me start with the value at stake. And it's clear that India is a reluctant urbanizer, but the journey is inevitable. These lines show you the pathways of all countries in the world. All countries urbanize, and India will too. Uh, it's key to India's future because between 40 and 60% of our citizens will live there. The difference between 40 and 60% for 2030 comes from the definition of urbanization which India has. It is a very strict one, and if you apply it, all the three elements of it, then 40% of India will be urbanized by 2030. If you relax it and make it much more around how citizens think about it, then some would say that 50% of India already lives in our cities, and this number will easily go to 60%. So in either case, we are no longer talking about a fraction of India, we're talking about a meaningful part of India. And from a GDP point of view, close to 69% of India's GDP will come from her cities, where today it's about half. So this is material to India's future. 70% of new jobs will be created in her cities. This is again important because we have, as you know, 10 to 12 million people who come into the job market every year. And urban India is where the crucible of new job creation, primarily because of the structure of the Indian economy. Rural India will hopefully become a lot more productive. Non-farm jobs will increase in huge numbers, but the almost 42% of Indians who are currently employed on farms will drop closer to the 7 or 8% required. And it's already happening, triggered by Narega, triggered by the mix of crops. And so it's quite obvious that if we want our young to be employed, then cities will become important areas, provided we build them well. And finally, because of this combination, that you'll have more people and a lot more of economic activity will be urban in its nature, a lot of the per capita growth in India will increase because of what happens in India's cities. So the 1,663 per capita USD that we have today will grow to 6,400, and a lot of it will be in urban, while the rural will also grow from 3 to 4. Now, one other angle of Indian cities is how it could actually help India's GDP growth. I'm going to steal Jagan's point of India will add one Chicago a year. And even as India adds one Chicago a year, by the way, for the next 30 to 40 years, this would drive construction. And if you look at China's economic story, such a huge part of China's economic story came from the investment that they made in their cities, came from the build-up that it gave to their GDP. So anywhere between 0.5 to 1% of GDP growth rate in India could come from construction and allied services associated with city building. And when you're growing at 6.5%, or perhaps 7%, 0.5% to 1% is a welcome addition to any country's GDP, especially if it continues for the next 30 to 40 years. So this is why cities matter. And what's equally interesting is if you look at it from the point of view of states, for the first time, almost 5 states will be more than 50% urbanized. Tamil Nadu is an exception in India today. But if you look at the next 15 years, Gujarat, Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Punjab will add to the list of states which will have more citizens in urban India than they will in rural India. Whether this will have an implication on politics and on voting is still to come. Maybe our voting districts will be redrawn. But even if that were not to happen, the voices of the cities will become more material in the parliament, as they have in the last 2 elections. And we will have 68 cities with populations of more than 1 million. Just to contrast, all of Europe has 35, and India will have 68. And this is where, by the way, almost 60-70% of the investment of India will be. So we will have large cities. I mean, 1 million plus population is huge, though in India, we take it for granted because our metros are so huge. And the top cities will be countries in the making. If you look at Mumbai, Delhi, and Calcutta, their population and their GDP will be the size of Malaysia. And if you look at Bangalore, Chennai, Ahmedabad, Pune, Hyderabad, Surat, it will be what Mumbai is today. And the reason I'm bringing this out is look at the mental model we have of our cities. Look at what it takes to run a Malaysia. These cities will have, GDP bigger than New Zealand. I'm not even talking of the smaller countries like New Zealand and Portugal. This is Malaysia. And think of the organization, the institution, the political capability that is required to run a Malaysia. And juxtapose that with the Bombay Municipal Commission. And however wonderful an agency it is, do we run Malaysia the way do we run Bombay the way Malaysia does? I mean, Malaysia within it has a central government and state governments. Our Bombay as a city is run by BMC. So the mental model of what it takes to run our cities has to move away from an IAS officer and 3 sweepers and 4 electrical engineers. I mean, that mental model has to change. Our cities are like huge countries, and they deserve the governance that their size demands. And therefore, we will almost have 3 jobs to be done in our cities in parallel. One is we have to renew the core. We have a large number of metros, perhaps even the top 600 cities, which are already so huge that we have to renew what the cities stand for. We have to improve the quality of life for our citizens, and we have to redevelop cluster by cluster and perhaps city by city the current old cities or the current centers of the city. And if we don't do this, there will be quite interesting implications. For example, I don't know if you know, but South Bombay, which is Haji Ali, till the end of South Bombay, has been shrinking as a GDP and as a part of the city for the last 4-5 years. And there are 2 reasons for it. One is that the cost of living there has become so crazy that most people don't want to live there. And second, the time it takes to access South Bombay from the suburbs, which is where most people who can afford homes live, is now so prohibitive that the cost of getting a secretary, a good secretary in that part of the city, is 5 times or 6 times what it is in Delhi. And so big companies have just moved out of there. You can't hire a secretary. Now, I'm oversimplifying to make a point, but isn't it interesting that South Bombay, right from Kolaba up to Haji Ali, is shrinking in GDP for the last 5 years? And a lot of it is because the city has not been renewed, and BKC and the others have come in and now taken the economic activity away. So the center of our cities, and the World Bank did some work last year, and it was very interesting to see that they talk about S-curves of city growths. And in some of our biggest cities, we're already starting to shrink before we have maximized the productivity of our cities. So core city renewal has to be an important part of any of our urban agenda. At the same time, because we have anywhere estimated between 5,000, 6,239, 7,239 by various estimate towns, we need to make sure that the second set of towns don't end up being like Bombay, don't end up being ruined the way we have successfully ruined Pune and Bangalore. And so we have to make sure that they grow smartly right now. And even as we allocate fund and focus to the big metros and the big cities, we don't let them in 10 years end up being exactly where the cities are today. And we also have to make sure that through all of this, as we look at this, we sustain viability of our cities. And I'm just calling that out in the form of 3 things. We have to think about how we design our cities to build inclusion. Inclusion by income, inclusion by religion, inclusion by community. We need to protect the soul of our cities. We don't want our cities to end up being like some of those in China who are now looking for purpose and looking for an identity. We don't have to go there because we can learn from all the mistakes that other countries and we ourselves have made in our cities. And we need to innovate for mechanisms of scale. While we've come late to the party with rather large cities. And so a lot of solutions that come our way from other cities, we don't have time to do that. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about this. We need to have almost an urban innovation agenda to be able to say, how do we do so much at this scale in a relatively shorter period of time? And for that, we need almost a leapfrog. The good thing is, whether you look at industry in India or commerce in India, this is something that India has learned how to do, because even in manufacturing, even in services, our economy is kicking off only now. And there you see how Indian entrepreneurs and Indian companies are innovating to do things differently. A lot of it because of technology, but most of it because of mindset. And perhaps that's what we need to do. So we therefore have these 3 jobs that need to happen almost simultaneously: protecting the core, preventing the next 5,000, 6,000 towns from ending up like our big towns, and for all of them, making sure we bring an Indian identity, an Indian solution of inclusion, of being Indian, and more importantly, of scaling up of whatever we are trying to do in a much quicker period of time than other cities and other countries had the luxury of. So where do we start, and what is needed? Well, the start position is quite grim. And I thought it was quite interesting that today was the day that we were doing the speech, because I live in Gurgaon, and coming here was very, very interesting. And all through it was resonating that our cities are really struggling, and it's across all every single area that matters to citizens. And you know most of this, so I'm not going to bore you about it. But you know, 30% of sewage in our country is treated. 24% of urban populations live in slums. And by the way, if you look at projections, half of our slums in the future are in tier 2, tier 3 towns. And we almost need 44 million homes, affordable homes, to make sure that we don't end up slumming out all of our cities. Only 70% of the solid waste is collected today, and the numbers are hugely lower when you go to tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 towns. And you know, it's across a whole bunch of things. And the surge in demand for services is only increasing because the numbers of people who live in our cities is increasing. And if you look at it on the right-hand side, every single service is going to be required 5, 7, 3 times more, while the supply side factor is not growing at the same level. So if you just simply extrapolate, the struggle that we have with our cities today is only going to get exacerbated like it has in the last 5 or 6 years, because people in the cities are not reducing in number. And by the way, the interesting thing in our cities is the big migration happens only, the national migration happens only to Bombay and Delhi. The rest of the migration happens within a state because of language. So a lot of the India growth story is not because of migration. Almost 50 to 60% of it is organic growth within the city. Even if you were to shut the doors, our cities would still need much more service levels in the next couple of years, because you have enough people and we're still producing 2.1 kids per household going forward. So this increase in service demand is required even if India, it'll never happen, but if India were to shut the door of cities and say no more migrants coming in, this is inexorable. And this trajectory, if it's not managed, could lead to urban decay. The Detroit example, or what's happening in Puerto Rico now, is an exception that we're looking at. But we've seen this happen at this stage of development in Latin America, and we've seen the implication of it on overall economic situation. The city doesn't fire, the economy slows down. Bombay, again, is a terrific example of it. Who would have thought that the largest representation of investors would be in Gurgaon and not in Bombay? But one of the things, I worked for 25 years in the corporate world, and you know that a company chooses a head office based on one single factor. That factor is not demand, it is not real estate, it is not government access, it's just where the CEO's wife wants to live. And no CEO's wife, whether Indian or foreign, wants to live in Bombay. Right? And that's why Gurgaon is where everybody now has a head office. And so people vote with their feet. And if you really cut through all the crap and look at a city at its heart is a value proposition to two sets of people. You give a value proposition to an investor and say, I'll give you infrastructure, I'll give you law and order, I'll give you technology, come and put your money here, create jobs, and you'll make money. And then that proposition becomes a proposition for talent, saying if you're smart, hungry, aspirational, come to a city and we'll make it work. That's what a city is. It's a market for these two people. And what happened in Latin America was half of this equation got killed. No person went there. And if your cities didn't have investments, they would be like South Bombay today. So to me, one of the big implications of this, other than political, is also significantly economic. And we could easily get trapped into a lower middle country logic if the cities don't fire. And a lot of it would happen if the quality of living in our cities really sucks even more. But the good news is it's fixable, right? And we've seen this happen in Shenzhen, the before and the after photograph, and of course, Singapore. And while we might dismiss Singapore and say it's not large enough in size, which is true, the approach behind Singapore or Shenzhen or North Carolina or whoever else is the approach that we have to adapt and adopt for India. And in many ways, therefore, the thought we had was that Indian cities need almost a new operating model. I mean, it's a horrible world. You'll have to forgive me because the word reflects the antecedents of where I spent most of my life. But we are looking for a new way of doing things. And I wanted to quickly take you through the 5 elements of this. The first one, not particularly important in the long term, but very critical, is funding. We have systematically underinvested in our cities. We've spent about $17 per person per year on capex. If you go to Panvel, this is about 1 cent, right? Because in Panvel you don't send anything. So this 17 actually reflects about 80 that we do in Bombay, 0 that we might be doing, in a tier 4 city, and the 1 cent that you do in Panvel. And you don't build a city without capital investment. We also, of course, struggle with O&M and OPEX, but CAPEX is a huge issue. And so if you just looked at what we need in our cities, we need about $1.2 trillion of capital funding for the next 20 years. It's a huge amount of money because our total GDP this year is about $1.8 trillion. But remember, 50% of this is to do catch-up. We should have spent half of this over the last 20 years, and 50% of it is for the future. So we need about $1.2 trillion in capital, and we need about $1 trillion more for OPEX. Because in each of these, you need to do repair and maintenance, you need to do upgradation, you need to do service provision. The great news about India is funding this is not a problem, because India hasn't used any of the levers of funding. World across, cities use 4 levers: land monetization, because the government usually owns a lot of land, like in India; property tax and user charges; debt on the balance sheets of cities; and support from the central government where the local revenue doesn't add up. And in India, none of our cities, not even Bombay, not even Delhi, have leveraged any one of this, for the most part because the government hasn't sold land. Cities don't have balance sheets. How will they get ratings? How will they get funds, right? Even though we've introduced muni bonds now. And we don't have a mechanism for property taxes. So the challenge in India is not whether we can get this funding raised. We can. Banks will lend us, municipal bonds will work. All our cities can do. The real issue is, in many ways, how do we get the municipal system and the government system to be equipped enough to be able to raise property taxes, collect them, create a balance sheet of the city so that CRISIL can rate it and then we can raise money, create a land book and an asset registry so that it could be sold in a transparent manner. It's the mechanics of raising the funds that are important, not whether the funds are large. They're actually not large. And wherever it's possible, we've seen it work. And MMRDA is a great example, and they continue to leverage this. So the first piece almost in running our cities is somebody has to make money available. You don't develop cities without money. The good news is it's there if we could get our act together. The second thing is we need governance. It's fascinating for me to see that, if you look at our cities, 20 cities in India are large enough to demand a metropolitan municipal structure, because some of those services are better provided in a metro framework. And 20 of our cities are large enough to justify that. I mean, if you look at the UK, Greater Manchester is only the second area that's likely to be there after London. But India today, with our level of urbanization, already has 20 of them. We haven't thought of a metropolitan municipal structure. We still think of all cities pretty much playing the same game. We don't have mayors. We are perhaps one of the very, very few countries in the world with no elected executives. And some of our bureaucrats, by the way, are very, very good. And some of them are very committed. But if you have a mandate for 2 to 3 years and you've done a whole bunch of other services and don't really understand the complexity of urban reform, and more importantly, if you don't have access to political alliances, because in cities you make choices and you make choices on behalf of citizens, you end up with what's happened with the city development plan in Bombay. It's a sensible plan. You can improve it, you can question some elements of it, but it was never sold. And so you ended up with the city rejecting a CDP. So even a brilliant bureaucrat just doesn't have the political mandate, because city development is a political issue. You're taking a 20-year view, a 30-year view, and how can somebody who has a job for 2 years and who does not represent the voice of its citizens take that decision on behalf of the city? So we need elected mayors. And whether the elected mayors are political in the long term or short term is a totally different issue. But we need long-term owners of cities. That's how cities get built. And if we had an owner, we would have accountability. It's very easy not to be accountable. Or it's very easy when great bureaucrats say, let me at least do the few projects that I can do in 2 years and 3 years and forget the big ones. And so you end up with every tenure of every good bureaucrat, you just end up pushing the big decisions down the can because nobody's accountable. So it would be good if we had accountability. It would be good if we had transparent accounts. It would help us raise money. It would be good if we understood costs to be able to price our services well. We don't have standard cost budgeting in our city. So how on earth do you price water? How do you price power? And it would be good if we could then ensure recovery and collection. Bangalore and Surat are thinking about it, and it'll be interesting to see how that happens. But you don't put $1 trillion of capex and $1 trillion of opex into an opaque system where you can't see who will be accountable for spending that money and spending it well. And we also don't have reliable agencies. It's very difficult for governments to run buses. right? Best is a great example in Bombay, where it's an agency associated with the government, but it's a transportation business, right? And people with transportation experience do it. We need agencies of that kind for water. We need it for public service. We need it for perhaps for health. We perhaps need it for education. To provide a whole bunch of services, we don't have to privatize, but we definitely have to create agencies. And these agency structures are important to be created because no government department can provide service to millions of citizens on a daily basis. And finally, of course, we don't have talent. I remember I was part of a workshop last year where we had called municipal commissioners from the top 20 cities in India, and we spent a full day talking about what should be the organization design of cities. You know, we had great examples. Bangalore and New York have the same population. The Bangalore Municipal Corporation, after the growth of Bangalore, 3x overnight, has 20,000 people. 19,000 of them are class 5 employees, all critical, and they have, 20 of 30 officers. New York, same size. Remember, these are 20,000 people. New York has 2 lakh people, and the teeth to tail ratio is very, very different. So we had this huge, big conversation and exciting. At the end of it, a really nice commissioner who's the head of Chennai, he basically told us that we were all smoking dope, because he said, do you know how many people I have in my HR team? And we said, tell us. And he said, I have a clerk who gives salary checks every month, and that's all I have. And here you are talking about talent and about attracting talent and creating career paths and retaining people and creating a sense of purpose and being responsible for citizens. I have one salary clerk, right? So we have norms in our cities. The way we run our cities is literally perhaps the way we would have run it when it was. I sometimes feel villages are run better because of the Panchayati Raj. There's much clearer accountability, much more resourcing than we have in our cities. So it's interesting to me that we don't have norms for our cities. We don't have a roaming pool of experts. Imagine designing transportation solutions for city. It requires huge amounts of expertise. You can't pick up a guy off the street and have him do it. We don't know whether we should, and perhaps we should standardize and outsource some of these functions. We're just starting to build a municipal cadre, which is absolutely terrific. And by the way, no city person can source an employer unless he goes to the employment exchange. And when was the last time the employment exchange of this country reflected the talent pool? But according to the government norms, you can only hire from the employment exchange. So even if somebody was excited about running their city well, they would just be landlocked because they just don't have talent to do any of this. So to me, the second big issue in governance is we don't have mayors, we don't have accountability, we don't have reliable agency systems, we just don't have talent, and we don't think about the structure of our cities in a smarter way than we should. The third one, of course, is planning, right? We need integrated plans, rigorous, based on data, thoughtful, because it has to reflect choices, and the choices will always put one part of the society against the other, and collaborative. Collaborative because citizens have to buy in, or representatives of citizens have to buy in. And especially in our municipal voting systems, where winning the local city municipality is a huge political issue, it's so easy to kill a plan because it came under your opposition's political tenure. So we need to think about integrated plans. You guys know all the jazz behind it, which is the 50-year concept plan, and then the master plan, and the CDP, and all of that. And we need to do all of that. And it's quite interesting that when you looked at Bombay's plan, which they were doing keeping in mind 2052, just the fact that Bombay by that time would have 35 million people made the land use of Bombay come into such limelight, right? And you just realize that the whole land, and by the way, BMC doesn't control 2/3 of the land because it sits with BPTP and with a whole bunch of other people. So the implication of thinking through the future to design for today is an essential part of all of our cities. And of course, thinking about smaller things like FSI and FAR and moving away from a single simple solution to a granular approach makes a lot of sense. This one is also a bit tricky because this is the bastion of collecting rent for our political parties. And the moment you make this transparent, politicians have a huge set of issue because it's when you give plot by plot exception that you're able to raise money for political funding. So, but integrated plans which will make this transparent and find other ways of contributing to political funding is an important part of the choices that we make. I'm not going to take you through more details on it, but planning, of course, is a one-day workshop on its own. And it's interesting for us to, in fact, it'll be very interesting as part of Amrit to see how we are able to do our cities, but because clearly, if you run in the wrong direction, even if you run twice as fast, it doesn't take you very far. And so the plan is the crucible of the choices that we will make. In addition to this, of course, we need sector policies. Why should somebody invest in city A versus city B? The economic policy of a city matters. Affordable housing, the whole policy of affordable housing. I won't take you through the details, but affordable housing solution which doesn't take rental into account is non-viable from the first day, right? Even if you build, we have 30-40% of the bottom of the pyramid in our cities who can never buy. And so, like great cities elsewhere, we have to create a rental mechanism, a mechanism where public housing belongs to the state. You create a mechanism to maintain it, you create a mechanism to allocate it, and you create a mechanism to run it. And so, to me, the affordable housing piece is not just about building houses inside the city and not in Dahisar and not outside Delhi, because those guys need to be next to where the jobs are. And so mixed living and allocation of land where the jobs are. But it's also about the whole mindset of creating a rental market and not just an ownership driven market. And sustainability and climate change. Bombay gets flooded every time it rains during high tide in Mahalakshmi and in Mahim. We're seeing what's happened to our city here. And think about, I live in a high rise in Gurgaon, which is a perfect example of how not to build a city. And it's all in glass, and I'm on the 22nd floor, and we have earthquakes. Right? It's a fascinating time to be in your home, and you're just praying hard. And my mom, who was 75 and visiting, said, "Chodo, agar marna hai to marenge," and she took the elevator down. Right? And I'm saying, this doesn't make sense, right? So we have to think about the implications of the environment and climate change because it's here and now. It's not an option to delay it for tomorrow. And so it's fascinating to think about how do you build city systems? How do you build the institution that will run our cities? And the heart of our city debate cannot just be about outcomes of the city. It has to be about, can we build the institution that will build the city? Can we build the unseen, invisible city systems that are important? Because it's not about the outcomes, it's about how we run our cities. And it's fascinating for me to see that other cities have done it. And I'm giving you the example of Charlotte City, not a big city in the US, but look at the mission statement. It could be the mission statement of any of us, right? To ensure delivery of quality public service that promotes safety, health, and quality of life for its citizens. And then when they started the rejuvenation, they focused on 5 things: community safety, transportation, this could be Delhi, by the way, revitalization of inner city neighborhoods, restructuring government and economic development. But they didn't stop with this. They then created a city scorecard, right, and said, how will all of this be developed? We need to think about almost 4 things that the city has to do: serve the citizen, run the business, manage the resources, develop the employees. And beneath this was an organization structure that was created. There were people hired, there were jobs created, there was accountability done, there was training, there was a whole bunch of things. Amrit, at some level, should help create the institutions that will run our cities. Without that, we're going to do project after project, and the overall integrated approach will not happen. The same thing, by the way, happened in Barcelona. If you look at Bombay, we have 32 wards, right? These guys also had their own wards. And then for each of the wards, at the district level and then at the sector level, so if you take water or if you take it education, they really thought about, okay, how do you cascade this 20-year plan to what this team who works in water or this team that works in Ward A will deliver next year and 3 years out and 5 years out. And they thought about, how are we executing our strategy at the city manager level? At the sector and district manager level, what are the KPIs and action plans? How do we allocate our budget? And everybody talks to you about, collective budgeting and Porto Alegre, and maybe Delhi will do it. But on what basis do you allocate budgets, right? You will see elite capture happen in all of our cities because the elite in Gurgaon think the best thing that they have done is empty the road on Sunday and do skateboarding. And on the other side of the highway, you have 18% of girls still getting married below the age of 18, but they don't get reflected on this side of Gurgaon because the elite capture has happened. And Times of India in English is talking about Gurgaon is now hot and happening because we've done this great thing and we've taken back our city on Sunday morning. And then you have the finance department to run all of it. So the point that I was making was, to me, it might seem gory and very corporate-like, but great cities are built through the invisible city systems. And if you don't build the organization, if you don't build the mechanism for planning, if you don't build the mechanism for allocation of jobs, for allocation of money, for holding people accountable, we will not be able to handle complex system which a city is. A city is one of the most complex organization structures that I have seen in my 25 years of work, right? So we need a new operating model. And how do we make it happen? In many ways, it's wonderful to see that there's been movement in the last decade, right? Especially since the mid-90s when the 74th Amendment happened. The God bless the amendment. It has still not been fully accepted or promulgated. And then JNNURM happened. And you can moan and groan about it, but JNNURM was the first official recognition of cities in a country that only recognized cities in 2001 in our political system, right? And they legitimized. And I remember we had done this review of JNNURM in its 6th year for the Planning Commission. And the fascinating thing that we found was twofold. One, if you remember, it was allocated state by state. And the states which had great bureaucrats had used all of the money. And the states like Bihar, where they didn't have they had great bureaucrats, but they didn't have great bureaucrats running municipal cities, did not even have capacity to do city development plans, to put together a project report. And so their money was still lying on the table. So it was fascinating to see that this money grab happened where you had capacity. It had nothing to do with who wanted. The second thing that was fascinating to see was most of the projects were around water and sewage. And we went and said, why? And they said, this is the one place where you don't have to meet other departments, and especially land. So the big things which one would have thought about road or transportation never got picked up because the bureaucrats who are smart and understand said, let's pick the projects where we will at least be able to deliver. Because JNNURM, if you remember, released money only on milestones being met. So the focus of JNNURM, which was urban renewal, integrated, ended up being water projects and storm water drains, all critical, but the overall integrated urban renewal fell by the wayside because we never created a mechanism to simplify the job of the bureaucrat who in Bangalore, for example, between MG Road and the new airport needs to talk to 18 different agencies and departments to make a change on a piece of land if he's looking at the road, right? So none of the big things really happened in JNNURM because the mechanism to make the big things happen was not thought through. That said, I love JNNURM. It was the first legitimization of urban cities in this country supported with a checkbook. And now I'm hoping that Amrit and the 100 smart cities will take it to one level higher. It'll be fascinating to see what Amrit looks like. On paper, there are elements of it which are amazing. So it's no longer going to be run by Papa in the center with naughty children in the States having to go back to him every month and say, I've done my job. Hopefully the delays will not happen. Hopefully there'll be a lot more capacity building. 2% of funds of JNNURM were kept for capacity building. Guess how much was used? Nothing. Nothing, not a rupee was used for capacity creation, right? But I'm hoping here with Jagan's help and NIUA's help, we'll be able to train people. And I'm hoping that we will see urban renewal in its truest form rather than project delivery of easy projects. So there is hope, and Jagan being involved, maybe there is more than hope. But in addition to this, I think we need an Amrit Plus. And I'm going to stop after 3 pages. But this is what I think we need. I still think this government has the time to make the governance piece done. And the most fascinating example for me is if you look at the Prime Minister of Italy, he was a mayor. If you look at the President of Indonesia, he was a mayor. If you look at the third most important person in China, he's the mayor of Shanghai, right? If you look at the great Boris in London, people say that he's going to pitch in next time and he might be a mayor, right? So politically, worldwide, including the Communist Party in China, has realized that city leaders are a great way to build the political cadre. And that is how you recruit people. And I'm hoping and praying that some political party in India will realize that, you know, Delhi is not an exception. And if Delhi can be created, the Delhi election can be won by a political party that focuses at ward level and does ward gram sabhas and sabha meetings and stuff, it might happen in every other state. So this is a stroke of pen decision, by the way, to be taken by a political party, but I wish that some of our political parties would say our future cadres will be people who work in panchayats, so that's the rural cadre, and who work in cities, and that's the urban cadre. And the way we will build our next tier of leaders will be by giving them responsibility at a ward level, and then at a city level, and then perhaps at a state level. So it's first fascinating to see that state chief ministers becoming the prime minister has happened. I'm looking for the day when a city mayor becomes a state chief minister and then one day a prime minister. But we do need clarity, and this is one of the fights that I wish we would take up in the center and also in the states, and get them to overcome two fears. One fear of the state political leaders that this guy might become too strong. We have to just make them realize it's part of their political cadre. And the second fear that if things become too transparent, in Maharashtra, if I lose control of the land-related revenues of Bombay city, then I'm no longer powerful. So the whole, tax that you earn from cities. The other thing is we need to think about capacity for our city leaders to have access. And a lot of it will not come as we wait for the municipal cadre. We need capacities of very different kinds. So for example, just imagine if all of our cities have to make books, account books, and close their balance sheets for every year because you have to raise funds. Now, you need commercial skills. We need cost accountants and chartered accountants and finance managers at a time when most Indian companies need them too. And how will you hire them? No government agency, no municipality is ever going to pay the kind of money that a company can. And so we might need to think about new ways of building this capacity, retired people, creating an outsourced team lease model, outsourcing norms, right? We have to be a little creative because our cities are going to look for capacity simultaneously as our industry is looking for capacity. Or if you look at technical, right? We need technical capacity across a whole plethora of things. How do you set standards and specification? What are the norms for transportation? How do you think about planning? I mean, we have barely 300, 400 planners who come out every year when we need 5,000. Fundraise, how do you raise money? How do you think about budgeting and pricing? How do you think about revenue collection, right? These are all skills that you need. And it won't be easy to do it at an individual municipal commission, municipality level. So we have to think of a new way of getting technical expertise and making it available for those cities who are using it. We need stronger academic government linkages. We need retired global talent, local or global talent. We need shortlisted experts on roles. Because if you speak to municipal commissions, they will tell you that, for example, let's assume I'm doing GIS mapping. Their biggest issue is the only guys who come and talk to me about GIS mapping are the vendors. And the vendors give me advice that will help their products sell. And by the way, at any point in time, we might have 30 cities in India buying GIS mapping approaches, and all 30 of them are doing their own stuff, right? So it's fascinating that we need technical expertise at a time when we will commit to technology choices without any expertise inside. We need a ULB leadership bunch. And we need vendors and contractors. One of the reasons Gujarat couldn't spend a lot of their JNNURM money in the last round was because they ran out of contracting capacity, right? And if the economy starts kicking in, we're going to need global standards. We need a whole new approach. So to me, even as we build the urban municipal cadre, we need to be a little bit more innovative in bringing capacity to town so that the enlightened municipal leaders, even if they are bureaucrats, will have access at call for expertise that they really need. And finally, I think we need an urban, a horrible word, right? I couldn't think of anything else. It was rather late. An urban innovation Wikipedia, because every city is making choices, for example, on city planning, right? Look at FSI norms. How do I think about zoning? How do I think about cluster redevelopment, designing for our weather and for density? A lot of them are thinking about how do you create enabling infrastructure, titling, creating asset books, or service SLAs, or technology standards, or agency structures. Pricing, think about increasing prices for water and power. So how do you think about getting a regulation or a regulatory framework so that the politician is not held accountable for price increases? But more importantly, what are the norms for pricing? How do you think about city engagement approach? Or the big investments, the transportation model for a city, the CapEx, OpEx norms, and OpEx being very critical from a R&M point of view, and the project management approach. Each of our cities is going to be making choices in this. And perhaps we will all stumble upon multiple approaches. So what I like about Amrit is it's not prescriptive. It says, do what you want to do. But you know what might also be helpful, like you see in other countries, is to give them a menu of option and say, if you want to do zoning, here are 4 ways of doing it. You choose the one that you want. If you want to do transportation, here are 6 ways of doing it. You choose the one that suits you. So it's almost like a buffet at a lunch, right? You can go and choose from among the options that exist there. Why should every city have to reinvent the wheel? In agri, in India, for those of you who follow agri, I spent half my time in rural India, you have something called green, which has come up in the last couple of years. And it's a small little thing created by a 26-year-old Indian who came back from the US, and he created pico cameras. He gave pico cameras to villages, and they basically upload on YouTube best practices. And it's fascinating. They do it in their own language. He has created the standard format. And within 3 days, by the way, you know which is a hit and which is not a hit, right? And so this whole extension system done centrally is interesting, but there are other ways of handling it, right? And so they're saying, let's find ways to help ourselves. We need an urban innovation Wikipedia. Hopefully, Jagan will call it something better. But we need somebody or some set of people who are collating best practices that are happening where there isn't enough best practices, who are creating innovation engines, not theoretically by working with cities, but making this available so that cities can focus on execution and not on thinking. No organization can be brilliant at thinking about complex issues and executing at scale, which is what our cities need. We have to release the capacity of our cities to execute. And we need to bring the thinking to somebody who represents the cities but is not inside the municipal commissions. And again, we don't have to be prescriptive, but it has to be made available to them. So my dream would be, in addition to Amrit, we have a PMO at the center, and in whichever state is excited, which runs the Amrit but creates the robust urban blueprint for the state that makes the Amrit piece work out well. My second dream would be that we use Skill India and innovative approaches to create massive job. I mean, you could almost see 15, 20 million jobs in our cities coming up in the next 10 years, right? So this would be a huge win-win. But even as we do skilling, we need to think about innovative solutions for capacity, scarce capacity, that our cities will not be able to pay for. And we need to create an urban innovation center, virtual, physical, I don't know, which will be at call for any city that wants to solve what are really complex issues. So let me stop here and see if any of this makes sense. But thank you for inviting me.
Thank you, Ireena. That was very commonsensical. It made a lot of sense. Thank you. Before I jump in with some questions, Raghu, I'd like to invite you for your discussion piece. You could sit and speak, and you can stand as well. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Ireena. That's a fascinating overview of what can happen in urban, what can't happen, what should we make it and do to happen. It was always a fascinating read to look at McKinsey reports, and I've been following FIDA for ages. I've also been involved in agri in some sense. Reading Urban Awakening was a good experience. The first topic always fascinates me was on the financing. I come from IDFC background in some sense, so finance was in the blood for some time. $1 trillion of investment of whatever sector we pick, and that happens to be India's infrastructure requirements also for the next 5 years, in some kind of strange coincidence. Other day, McKinsey Insights came out with one more number of Croatia needing $5 trillion in the next 5 years. Croatia. So I was thinking, come on, Croatia 5 trillion, India 1 trillion, okay, let me make it 5 trillion for India also. Then I started looking. When we start looking plans like this, even if you're wrong by a few lakh crores of rupees that side decide, doesn't really affect the overall conclusion. The way we look at it is that even if I have 1 trillion, fine, I can do so much. But if I don't have even 10,000 crores, so let me talk about a small city called Gulbarga. 2001, I joined EDIC. We were looking at their plan of how to improve their city. It's a very, very small place, North Karnataka, water scarce city. How do we go about doing it? The chief minister came out with a scheme to develop that city. For whatever reasons, they picked that particular city. So they were asked to give their wish list. They came out with a list of 40 different items, how they need to finance that. We sat up and added up everything, came to about 100 odd crores, 120 crores. So they came to the government at Bangalore, asked saying that, okay, I need 100 crores. The Principal Secretary Urban asked, saying that, okay, fine, you have 100 crores, I'll give you a check tomorrow, but how are you going to repay? His question was that repay, what does it mean? How do I repay? I said, like, if I had the money to repay, even if not now, 20 years down the line, why will I come here, first of all, and ask you the money? I simply don't have the capability to do anything. So these are the cities, and the Gulbarga, just for the sake of argument, is top 5 cities in Bangalore. No, sorry, top 5 cities in Karnataka. And we have bulk of the cities in the country of the same range. So we thought, as a good financier, try and estimate the debt-bearing capacity of that particular municipality. Use all kinds of mechanics to do that. Look at it for 20-year projections. Did all the robustness and tax revenues, land monetization, whatever you can think of. They estimate, depending on the assumptions what we take, a range between somewhere like 100 crores to 200 crores in the next 20 years for a city like that. So how are they ever going to do a project which is 500, 600, 1,000, 2,000 crores? City like Mysore, in their JNURM estimate, if I remember right, it's about 200 odd crores is their investment plan. Bangalore has about 2,000 odd, 3,000 crores of investment. So when these numbers were being debated, one of the things which the Karnataka PWD guy told me, how much does it cost to build an airport? Is a guess. His number is, okay, how much does a Bangalore airport cost? Let me put it that way. 2,500 odd crores, somewhere close to that. Delhi is about 10,000, 12,000, whatever numbers we're speaking. 2,500 crores for an airport at Bangalore. How much does it cost to build an airport in Gulbarga? Or any other city with this say? Their logic is simple. What is in a airport? One runway, one structure. Runway kitna hoga? 4 kilometers, 4 crores per kilometer, 16 crores. Structure, 10,000 square foot of space, multiplied by 1,000 rupees. So what is the number we are looking at? 30, 40 crores. By the way, Bangalore Airport runway actual costing was under 60 crores. The runway of Bangalore Airport actually costed 60 crores, not more than that. The total airport is 2,500 crores. So there's the question of what is the solution we are looking at. Are we overestimating all these numbers? Are we saying that if I do these numbers only, I'll be able to do anything anywhere? Or is there a way of finding a solution which is at a much cheaper cost? Is there a problem? Now, waste is a classic example. Look at treatment options. Now, we have multiple options, composting to waste to energy to, and all the vendors who are floating around in the country always come and speak about plasma. To the best of my knowledge, there are only 2 pilots, one at NASA, one is Japan. And that's the technology we're trying to use it in India left and right. And these are vendors who are there, we never experimented anything. Whatever mathematics you do in that sector, whatever you do, ultimately you'll end up purely on a financial basis on a composting option. Not that market exists for it. Again, the market for compost has been studied. The total requirement in the country of compost, just for your information, is not a manure, it's just a soil enricher in that sense. The total market for compost could be of the order of 4 lakh tons. The capacities are upwards of 8 lakh tons. How are we going to sell this particular product? It prices itself out once you cross 100 kilometers of distance. So if this is the system, this is a system everywhere in every urban sector. Why are we actually trying to look at a huge number and try and make the projects financially freestanding in that sense? Irrespective of whatever sector, irrespective of the location, irrespective of where we talk about whatever implementation models, I don't think any urban sector is going to be a profit center. It has to be a cost center. It is a cost center. All the examples which are there in the country or internationally, whatever we do in urban, it is a cost center end of the day. You need some support. So where is that support going to come from? It has to be from some kind of a government grant or a multilateral loan, which is extremely, soft padded. So there's no other way of doing it. This is the experience. So how do we handle this financial enigma? Now that's the problem when we say that why are credit rating agencies not coming and doing it? How will they do it? But there's no, whatever we do, there's no buoyancy in the numbers. How do we tackle that? This is a big, big problem. And we keep arguing about this quite a lot when you look at smaller projects. See, the theme in terms of where does urban growth go? Obviously, it's going to go to the 5, 6, 10 different big cities. The second cities, I don't know whether we have looked at the analysis carefully, but my guess feel is that it's like their growth, organic growth is still going to be 1, 2, 3%, not more than that. Only Bombay's and probably Delhi's will attract the 5, 6% growths. So all the other numbers are going to be much, much lower. And their requirements of investments are going to be much, much smaller. So we can do a lot probably with a much smaller numbers and big numbers. So we need to probably cut this pie into a big set of cities where we want to promote and put whatever facilities we want to do. Try and look at the cities which are much smaller scale at a much lower number. This is one way of doing it. I don't know. Whether it actually makes sense or not, we need to think about it. But I think that's the way I look at it when I look at financing. Because hardly any project is worthwhile. Whatever we do. Now, on top of it, we have systems which are trying to promote investments, like you take a VGF scheme of Government of India, or a PPP definition of itself from the Government of India. How much of government support should go into a project? Once I cross 40% number, or once I cross 50% number, do we still call it a PPP? Why not? And how do we actually tackle that? A sheer waste energy plant will have tipping fee plus power charges. The NPV of that in a project cost over a life cycle is going to be 70%. It's done by private sector. So is it going to be a good model of doing financing? I don't know. And these are the things which we keep debating. So financing challenge, one of course is the big numbers, but needs of the cities like Mysore or a Gulbarga or any other smaller town, which are about 100, 200, 500 crores. How do we tackle them? How do we actually make them sustainable is a challenge. Our understanding of finance is also quite vague at the city and the municipality level. Like for instance, one of the bigger metro systems took a multi-lat loan at a LIBOR plus 200 points without reset 15 years was offered. I thought it was a great deal. They didn't draw a single rupee so far on that. And they went for a HUDCO loan, which is with all kinds of mortgages, all kinds of systems, everything is taken, 9% floating every quarter you change it. So I don't know how it happens. I mean, even in the model, if you see, simple financial models, the way it looked like, you look at a LIBOR at that point of time. Fortunately, LIBOR is still low, but LIBOR 15-year, 20 average is going to be 3.5%, 4%. If 4% on top of it add the hedging risk, add the devaluation of rupees, any cost of a foreign loan is going to be much higher. So how are we going to tackle all these things? So these are the challenges which we need to think about carefully. And is a solution probably available for a city of a scale of Bombay or a city of a scale of, say, Hubli or something? Is it going to be the same? So we need to think about answers of how do we go about doing it. The second interesting statement, you had mentioned that in terms of talent, in terms of what is available, what is not available. Other day, MOD asked me one question. How come when we get a lot of consultants in front of us, but how come I don't see any IIMs in front of me? I get to see people like you who are not IIMs in that sense. I didn't mean that, but anyway, so that was the statement. So I have the same question. Why do you think that you don't see IIMs in front of you? Why do we think we don't see any IIMs in the urban sector? In these, as an advisor, I'm sure McKinsey has quite a few of them, but McKinsey doesn't play the government advisory or the transaction advisory roles, which is what most state governments and the municipalities and the parastate agencies want on a day-to-day basis. They want a team which is going to firefight every second, and they want a team, their expectations of the team is a high-end advice at the cheapest possible cost. If they can get away with not paying, it's the best option. But anyway, my previous company I was running is a 6 crores receivables out of 20 crores turnover at one point of time. Entirely government receivables. So anyway, that's the kind of systems what we have. And why are we not getting that kind of talent into the sector? Because it's all there. So it's all the systems which we have a problem. Bangalore Water Supply Board, it's like a well-recognized water board of the boards which is there in the country. We have taken the proposal to send their engineers to go and see different best practices world over. The proposal was rejected 3 times by the Chief Secretary. So we can't send people out to see anything. They just don't want to send. It's not a question of money. They can easily afford that. And we are willing to find a sponsor who's going to take them. But they simply don't want to do it. So if that is a way of capacity and the skill development, that's a challenge which we need to think, how do we go about handling that. On the, what we call, the first reaction which I had when the McKinsey came out with this report, you had the 5 principles in which it's all happening. At the same time, Government of Karnataka was going for a bid to engage different transaction advisors for various sectors, and we are kind of applying for the position. First thing that struck me, suppose hypothetically, let's assume that all the 5 elements what we want actually happen. Are we sure that urban problems are going to be solved? Will they be solved? Or is it good enough, or is there something else missing or not there? I personally don't think it's going to solve all the problems. There are 3 key elements we kind of missed out in the urban game so far. One is data. We simply don't have data on anything. It's like you take a guess. I mean, every number is a guess. Population is a guess. Area is a guess. Investment is a guess. Service level is a guess. Investment requirement. I mean, everything is a intelligent guess by some people, some cases. We simply don't have data. But the world is changing. Data capture has become much stronger, much better. But maybe there with a different set of people, not necessarily the city managers and the policymakers. But people like who are controlling a mobile system or the apps, they have the data today. How do we use that? That's one thing which we need to see. Second one is on the collaboration. We use these two words. Actually, data plus collaboration is what we need to do. I think that's the right way. I strongly feel that that's the way to go. Collaborations simply don't exist for various reasons. Take a city like a Delhi or say like a Bangalore. NCR region cuts across so many different states. And even within Delhi, you have so many agencies, and try and build a road from this side to that side of the road. How do you go about doing it? One of the officers in Karnataka, whom I know, had the courage to start putting a road into AP. He's saying that is where the demand is. So if I don't connect my road to that place, there's nothing which I'm doing for the development of the city. So you start putting the road into the other state. Obviously, other PWD woke up and then they started fighting, and then that road never happened, end of the day. But when the plan actually was drawn, that's the way it is, because the urban growth is not defined by geographies. It's going to be the sprawl which is happening the way naturally. So how do you do it? So he had the data in terms of that particular city is actually consuming whatever he has to offer. Hence, you need to connect. The only way to connect is to start putting something. But then the administrative and other boundaries came in place. How do you look at this data per se, and how do you track the data? Karnataka has come out with a report called State of Urban Infrastructure, and we were kind of proud authors those days. But we put one caveat. We will never, ever authenticate this data. We will never, ever say that this data is correct. We just collated and printed it. Well, that's there ends the matter. Beyond that, so one senior IAS officer from the state also mentioned, saying that like when we ask the data, tell me what is the road length of a city. The answer depends upon who's asking the question and when you are asking the question. So it's, for what purpose are you asking the question? The data changes so frequently, so no one can authenticate. So that's the problem. But having said that, that is not the way to take decisions in urban. So how do you go about doing it? We need to think about it very, very seriously. Fortunately, the technology has changed, and fortunately, we have options to capture data in a much more scientific, objective manner. Hopefully, this will be put to use, and hopefully, we'll try and do something. Collaborations is the next one. You said academic collaborations are weak. Forget the academic. Interdepartmental is a known case all over the place. No one talks to each other. We write so many contracts, and because PPP is the area which we work, PPP stands as a contract, so we do it. But the fundamental premise, the day one when I joined, one of our legal heads told me that you write the PPP contract assuming that there are three players: government, private sector, and probably the user. You should write a contract distrusting that all three will collude with each other. You should write such a manner that they don't collude and then cheat the other guy. So how do you go about writing this contract? That's the way the PPP contracts are written. So many termination clauses, so many issues which are there in the contract. Actually on the service delivery, actually how do you go about doing it? It doesn't exist. So is that the way of collaboration, what we are talking about when we speak of PPPs? There's no reason they failed. It's bound to fail if this is the way it is there. But having said that, there are better ways. Now the first question is that Australian mechanism of going for alliancing contract. Start talking about it. The standard objection to that, we are not mature enough. Mature for what? Now, how do we go about it? When are we going to get matured on this particular topic? It's not going to happen. Either we take a decision today and go ahead, or no, stop it. Stop doing these projects. But without private sector, we won't get anything. But what is the way of going forward and doing it? So we need to think about that. That openness, transparency is what is missing. When Amrut guidelines are, we conceived at the point of time, and World Bank was doing some seminars, and I was part of some committee to see something. We kept on arguing, saying that the only way to look at is to get some data and transparently publicize it every day. You think your population is so much, you put it on the web. You think your service standard of a water supply is so much, put it on the web. Doesn't matter. If you're wrong, you correct it later. But once you start self-certifying, I'm sure the city manager probably in his own personal pressures can come out with data. But if his boss, like a principal secretary urban or a chief secretary, has to certify it, over a period there will be some kind of a stability in the numbers, stability in terms of getting more accuracy in the numbers. So there has to be someone taking responsibility in doing it. Today, what happens is some third party who's absolutely no link tries to certify something. But suppose we get the data right and get it transparently publicized, and then work in a manner with we trust the other guy. Hopefully, things will happen. Hopefully, the mechanisms will be able to sort out. So what we keep telling ourselves is there's a huge leap of faith between knowing everything in urban, but actually implementing it, getting down, translating a big idea to a project on the ground. It's a huge, huge leap of faith. We have not taken that in the past. We have been doing all kinds of very random interventions here and there in terms of projects, in terms of skills, but there's no holistic, comprehensive idea how to go about doing it. Probably we cracked that system a little bit. Hopefully these three elements in terms of data, in terms of collaborations, in terms of transparency, if they happen, I think then the data systems will change. Otherwise, the broad level, there's no dispute at all on everything. All of us have opinions about sector. All of us keep talking about. But then, that's the point. Who is all of us, all of we? Who has to change? That's the point. If we become a partner in the entire collaboration, that's the way probably it will happen. Otherwise, left to only the people, few people, it's quite stark. I mean, even if we talk about Bangalore, I mean, this is my last example before I stop. Bangalore is a city which is known for IT. I mean, the CDP was done at the time, French company was helping them, we were seeing it. Those of you who kind of track Kannada movies, there's an icon, Rajkumar. He passed away. It's a natural death. There's nothing to, it's just natural death. There are riots erupted in the city. And when the body was taken from one end to other, there's no reason. There's a rampages in the places. Why is it? Is that Bangalore different from the Bangalore which is there's IT face? How do we handle that? It means that like, half the people are not part of the overall system. So what we see is a few guys who have cars, who have sit in IT buildings or work with Microsoft or someone, but not the people who actually probably manage a swimming pool or manage an auto rickshaw. How do we integrate them? And that integration won't happen by a top-down approach. It has to happen with some kind of a collaboration. So these things matter. Probably my solution to all these things is data transparency and probably collaborations. Thank you.
Thank you, Raghu. I'll just pose one question to both of you. You may respond if you'd like, and then we'll open up to the audience. We have been getting a lot of flack from the audience that we don't give them enough time to get involved in the dialogue, so we'll try and do that today. But I'm glad you used the phrase leap of faith, Raghu, because I think what is tending to get missed out in all our conversations, which talk about mechanics, which talk about finance, the oil that oils the machine and everything. We talk very little about the development of human capability. And I think that's the most fascinating part about working on cities. Cities are supremely designed to let human beings achieve their best. And I think probably capturing GDP is one of the ways we found to measure that. Just the amount of wealth that we are able to produce in this very complex system that Ireena was talking about. All of that is really driven by this leap of faith. And the poor know it. The people who do a task for 5 rupees, they do it for 10 rupees. They are working towards that leap of faith. And it would be fascinating if we can find the data, find the arguments, find the analytics to capture precisely this. You know, I think it's fascinating what both of you have brought to the argument, and I think it's the audience that needs to engage with this more than I should. But a couple of points which I want to recap from Ireena's presentation, which I think were fundamental to understanding cities. One was the point about indigent populations, and I think that's connected again with human capability in cities. The fact that it is not migration, which is really where we need to be looking constantly, and it's such a smokescreen now. Everybody's talking about migration as being some of the most important issue. It's indigent populations. As they grow by themselves, naturally, families grow. They have stakes in cities, and indigent populations are probably our best bet. And we don't cultivate them. The political class cultivates migrants. They do not actually reach out to indigent populations. And perhaps that's a way to cut through a lot of this, if I may use Ireena's word, crap. We do need to work through that. But also coming to the point about talent, I'm so glad that both of you engaged with the idea of talent, the capacity, the local availability of that manpower, and how we can turn that to our advantage is going to be a very fascinating challenge. And I have some friends here from the Aam Party who I think are trying to do this, trying to tap what Delhi has as immense pools of talent and knowledge. And I hope that they can find a way to do that, because that might be what will tip that balance. The indigent population investing, taking that leap of faith and investing in cities. But having said that, I think it was absolutely fascinating what both of you have spelt out today. And today we will have the luxury of time to have the audience really engage with the speakers, which is really wonderful. So I open it out to the audience, and I'd like Snehanshu. Yes, please.
Right at the beginning, you mentioned that the GDP of Mumbai is the same as that of Malaysia. Did I hear?
Will be by 2030.
Will be, okay.
Yeah.
So my question really is that why do we look at cities like Mumbai or Delhi as one city and not a collection of cities? Because if you look at Delhi, you have Vikas Puri, you have Janak Puri. All these Puris are actually cities. And can't they really work as a federation of cities instead of being looked at as one large thing that is impossible to comprehend?
No, I think you're making a very valid point, and it's almost at three levels, right? One is you have the Vikas Puris of the world, of Delhi, each of which is perhaps large enough to justify a municipal commissioner. Then you have Delhi as a city, which is huge and has more complex problems, but that would be true for all of our big cities. But then you would also have the NCR region. And if you look at how, and you know this perhaps as well as I do, if you look at how cities are governed, we will need governance at all three levels. Because if you look at it from 2 points of view, some of the biggest capital investment that you make in a city, transportation, airport, connectivity outside, will be at the level of NCR. Otherwise, you can't justify it, right? On the other, and perhaps the proposition of Delhi as safe or as a good place to come and invest in will again be at the NCR level. But the community belonging, the bottom-up buy-in, the way you do cleanliness, the way you do Swachh Bharat, the way you do stormwater drain management, the way you do community policing, can only work at a Vikas Puri level. So we need all three tiers of governance and all three angles for cities. If we only did it at the Vikas Puri level, we would never be able to justify the airport. If we only did it at the NCR level, we would never get the city citizen partnership responsibility piece to ever happen. So I think if you look at great plans, integrated plans for city, they play it out at all the three levels, and some cities actually go, even within Vikas Puri, they will go one level deeper, because the underlying assumption is any number beyond 5,000, the community becomes too large. So you've got to make a community of 5,000 to take ownership for critical things like community policing, right? So I think we should see three. Once we are a bit more evolved from a governance point of view, you might even see four, which incidentally was how old communities lived, right? So in many ways, we're going back.
That's my point.
Yeah.
If you look at Jaipur, that is how it
That's how it was constructed. So we were too rich too early in the history of our nation, right? But as a country, we're too young, and we have forgotten the wisdom of 300, 400 years back.
I teach at the School of Planning as a visiting faculty. I'm an urban economist. A couple of things, and having worked on the London plan for a fairly large chunk of time, I think when we are looking at Indian cities, we need to be a little careful in not following the Eurocentric understanding, the framework because there's stuff happening here which is much beyond that. And that's part of my work. But essentially, if you flip the argument around, the municipal bodies and the people who are running the very little 20,000 or 10,000 or even 1,000 people are doing a fascinating job. And I'll give you an example. The junior engineer in Delhi Jal Board in the South Division gets 300 calls a day and is probably staffed at 10% of what that person should be getting, but still manages, and it's a very, very politically aware constituency, still manages to get a lot of stuff done, despite the fact that 70% of the water supply pipeline is actually contaminated. So I think there are solutions already inside which need to be worked out, and I think hence talent, the point that Jagan made, was very important. The second thing that I'm seeing increasingly being missed out in the discourse, and this I'm referring also to the last talk, is there was a program called the Provision of Urban Services in Rural Areas. And I think the urban agenda in this country is being defined in the fringe rural areas. And it was indeed a pleasure to listen to what Raghu had to say, because having been a data person myself, I think we are all floating around the Lodi Road area on top of anecdotes. We don't have serious data. So any major highway is seeing rampant runaway urbanization, which it's not remotely on our radar. And I think that's where the front line of urbanization is. I think this conversation, if we were having 15 years back, would have made a lot more sense for our cities. I think the frontier of urbanization has shifted on, to several other places. And that's where it gets connected to the point that you made very well, that it's not migration. And so where are these people doing it? And one example I'll leave you with, and I'm sorry for taking that time. If you look of all the area from Haridwar to Dehradun, it's just city after city after city, and they are not cities in the definition of cities, but it's just a lot of land which is being plotted out. And my last request is that when we engage on any conversation, let us be acutely aware of whose city we are talking about. And I think just lumping it as informal sector, etc., is not going to work, because one of the key problems I had faced while we were doing the London plan, understanding it, was that of key workers. And if the informals aren't there, the case is finished even before it started. So thank you.
Thanks, Ranaji. Would either of you want to respond to that? Would you care to? Raghu?
It's correct. I mean, the points, whose city is it, is always a trouble to define. Now you start looking at a JNURM equivalent system when there's supposed to be a city development plan where you're supposed to engage with every stakeholder and try and come out with. It's like you don't talk to everyone who matters, and the people who are there trying to sit there and take decisions are completely different from the one who's actually going to have any role in the planning. So it's a kind of a complete systemic failure in that sense, that we are not putting everyone in place. But that has to be addressed someday, somewhere or there. So hopefully, the going forward, this is again a debate. Once you have three tiers of a government, someone at the central level deciding something, and a state which is supposed to do something, but ultimately the person who is going to implement is the third tier, who may not agree with the opinions or the targets set by someone else. So how do you get everyone? That's at three tiers. Then you start getting into wards and get the different people. It's going to be a complete challenge altogether. So there has to be some way of solving that.
Chetan Vaidya from HP. No, thank you. Both of you have, and you're on the two sides of a coin. So it was very, very fascinating. I mean, different points of view, but put it very nicely. One little bit of information for you. You mentioned that urban Wikipedia. We had Ramesh Ramanathan had started something called Peer Exchange and Reflective Learning in JNURM, and then NIUA took it over, and we have a lot of best practices. But how one could put it and transfer it and replicate it on a large scale? I mean, that is the question. Now, that basic information, a lot of that is now available. And particularly, I was looking at those 11 reforms now, at least 7 to 8 out of this NIUA documentation already had. But how do you transfer it? Because it has to have that context. That becomes very difficult. I think that is something we'll need to learn. And there are experiences elsewhere, but you can't just take it and it is not like a cookie cutter kind of thing. That's difficult. That's one. I thought I'll let you know that. Second thing, Raghu, you talked about very nicely about collaboration, transparency, and data. I mean, in India, you can go to anything and these 3 points become very... I will talk of university, same thing. Collaboration, transparency, data. I mean, the two departments, not only two departments, two professors in the same department do not talk to each other. Two departments, you have gone very far. But the question is, it's also again chicken problem. I mean, if you can start something to share at some level, something will happen. I mean, it's partly true that people don't want to, and you need that kind of enabling environment. But on the other side, if you start doing it, it will happen over a period. Gujarat have done well, not because there is one Keshav Verma, but because they have a history of giving responsibilities, functions, finances to the local bodies over a very long time. Gujarat and Maharashtra, for that example. So I think you need to think of that also. That one has to start somewhere.
Actually, Ireena made a very sound point on that. You will be leadership bench, if I get that terminology right. Sorry. When we are looking at some of the projects, because my experience has been largely Karnataka, I keep giving those examples. It was equally true for Madhya Pradesh or Orissa, which we worked there in the different places. The current theme in the market in urban is to create institutions or create special purpose vehicles, SPVs in some sense. Where are you going to get talent to man those SPVs? Now, is it a SPV going to be same guy who is a mayor sitting in a city or a commissioner and goes to the next room and says that I'm the head chief executive officer of a SPV? It's not going to work. What we have tried to come out in Karnataka, which I don't know, ultimately they'll take it forward or not, create some kind of a talent pool. And that talent pool is stationed not at the city level, but more at the state or the central level. And that pool can be shared with various agencies whenever required. UK is following this model a little bit. So you want a director who understands numbers or who understands technology. You won't get him in a smaller town. You won't get him in, let's say, Hubli Dharwad or let's go to Chhattisgarh, go to Raipur. You're not going to get that kind of talent. You need to have someone who's going to be available at certain cases. There are people who are going to work locally. Now, our own example in IDFC group, we have UDEC, we have IDEC. IDEC is in Bangalore, we survived. UDEC is not, for various reasons, because you're not getting talent there for organization. So how do you do it is only to have a pool who's going to have somewhere else and who's going to be available to them at all the places. So we have to think of options of like this and how do you engage them. So Orissa is trying that with their own model of creating urban funds. So is MP who's trying. But their idea seems to be that I want an expert to come and sit there. No, I'm not going to have my CFO go and sit in Bhubaneswar. He has to run one different company. But how do you translate his knowledge to other place? There should be some mechanism, someone front end, someone back ends. That kind of systems should be set in place. And that is relevant for urban. So why does the experience sharing, because experience sharing at one point of time becomes very macro. So I know BRT system in Indore, what is there? I know some system in Alandur. But can I do it in, say, some other city? Because that sharing is not there because I'm reading something else. I need to implement it. That experience has to come here. So we need some systems should be taken care of.
Yeah. I'm PH Rock here. This is for Ireena. This question, what I want to ask is, what are two most important mistakes which our small cities should avoid, which the current metros or the big cities are guilty of?
I think the first one is before municipal committees and commissioners get formed, they should create governance. It'll be tough to now. It should be done, but it'll perhaps be much easier to put a elected mayor or the right municipal structure in one of these little hamlets between Dehradun and Delhi, which nobody has occupied. I mean, try getting Shiv Sena out of BMC. But in Dehradun, in that little hamlet, it hasn't happened. So one is governance. The other one is, it sounds stupid, but the other one is planning. 40-50% of our problem comes from the plan being not future-proofed. And so we have, the building coming and then the water piece comes later or the road comes later. So the other thing that small cities can avoid is not having an integrated plan. And every city, there's again global work on this, and the same thing is true for India. Whatever numbers the city thinks it will be, usually you are 4 to 6 times larger. So we should just assume that if I'm a hamlet of 10,000 people, I'm going to be 60,000 in the next 30 years. And now what should my hamlet look like? So those would be the two things. Can we get the right kind of political representation in running of the cities with support from bureaucrat? By the way, this is the Calcutta model, so it's not new. And second, can we get an integrated plan really early in the game so that you build out the infrastructure first and then you bring the inhabitants, which means capex again.
Hi, Siddharth from NIUA. My question is for Ireena. Good presentation. I think the one thing I'm still not clear whether Gurgaon is a better city than Mumbai, because I kept going through the story whether both have their downsides. So that would be one thing. But second thing I'm sort of fascinated is the solution that you have proposed, the 5 basic elements. The basic framing that problem, does it lead it to be elitist in that sense? Is it vulnerable to elite capture just by defining the problem like that? My question is more relevant to whether this long-term planning, it sort of sees cities as a problem to be solved rather than managing everyday complexities. So the long-term development planning does not work because it does not talk about managing everyday complexities. So that, on that sense, I sort of agree with Raghu, because open data, you're sort of relying on the citizens themselves to make decisions on managing these complexities rather than doing this development plan. So I'd like to hear a...
See, a city is actually not a problem. A city is an opportunity, right? So the mindset is not of defensiveness of scarcity. The mindset is, we are so late to this party, we might as well have fun with it rather than mess up with it. So let me tell you, when we were helping the BMC a couple of years ago think about the city plan for Bombay, the question that came up is, who are we thinking about? So we segmented. We went and said, you have to think about all segments of citizens. In a city like Bombay, by the way, also in Delhi, you also have to think of the woman and the child, or unfortunately the lot of children who are sleeping on the pavement. So we actually had 10 different citizen segments. And what is fascinating is that the so-called SEC classification in India, the A and B between them account for less than 12%. So the city cannot be built only for the rich. The citizen's voice that has to come in has to be the voice of everybody. So for example, if you think about Bombay, it would be really sad if we did cluster by cluster redevelopment and we followed a European norm, as somebody was saying, and did not build space for the Ganesh Chaturthi festival. Because think of the groundswell that happens in Chowpatty on those last 2 days. And the city that you redesign for Bombay has to reflect that, because that's what makes the chawls and the communities work. So my point is, if you do a good integrated plan, you reflect every citizen segment. Singapore is a great example of this. 85% public housing. Each of the public housing, because it's a reflection of their riot-infested birth, has a mix of Malay, Chinese, Indians, Muslims built into the city plan. Right? You will never have public housing allocated only to a single community, because that is the ghost that haunts them. We have our own ghosts and we have our own opportunities. So to me, the integrated plan is perhaps the best approach a city has to reflect all her citizens. No city can be built only for the elite. It doesn't work. Because no city can be run, by the way, only by the elite. They create a lot of value, but they also extract a lot of rent in terms of city services. You have to build a city for the mass. And even the richest city in India, the center of gravity is not with the rich. Center of gravity is clearly with the middle class and the poor and the indigent.
I think it's an interesting question, because it also, I mean, to use the word ghost again, we've been carrying this fear of planning as well. There is always that fear that a plan tends towards totalitarianism, tends towards authoritarianism. But the plan is also the representation of a collective vision and a collective order. Now, we've not done a very good job of doing it collectively. And that's possibly the weakness that we need to overcome. But it can represent collective order. And again, if you look at planning theory, Thomas Jefferson wanted to cover all of America with a grid because it's as democratic as you can make order in space. There are many such models, and I think it's a very interesting and a very deep conflict in our thinking about cities, and now's the time, I think. Now's the opportunity to fix it.
I completely agree with you. And therefore, if you think at plans that work, not plans that are created on a piece of paper, great planning is not done only by planners. Great planning teams have psychologists and behaviorists and historians, right? And finance people and operational people. But more importantly, great plans are created for cities on behalf of the citizens. So great plans have to be owned by the citizens. Because in this whole narrative, we only talk about rights of citizens. There are also responsibilities of citizens. And no city is functional on an ongoing basis unless citizens own it. Which means unless citizens understand their rights as well as their responsibilities. So to me, it's very easy to beat up the country and to beat up the bureaucrats, but we also have a parallel, and a plan, by the way, is the best document to engage citizens and say, tum kya karoge? Right? It's a given, and we ruin our own cities as citizens. So the plan is it's not a vehicle of a totalitarian, it's a vehicle for discussion. And it's a vehicle for transference of responsibility, both sides, with mutual accountability. And therefore, great plans have to be disseminated. They cannot be thopofied on cities saying, kal se we are doing this. It doesn't work like that. So the planning process is an inclusive one.
Yes, please. Do you have a mic?
मेरा नाम सुनील कुमार है
जी.
मेरा प्रश्न है कि जो शहरों में लोग बाग काम करते हैं और मार्जिनल सेक्शन से जो है और जो इमारतें बनाते हैं, एक कहावत भी है कि जो मिठाई वाला कभी अपनी मिठाई नहीं खाता. जो मकान बना के चला गया, जो मिस्त्री था, उसके बारे में क्या सोच है, उसके बारे में क्या आगे की रणनीति होगी. और जब हम इस चीज को देखते हैं तो ग्राउंड पे वो जीरो मिलता है. ऐसा क्यों, शहरों में और गांव में?
ये तो आपकी अफोर्डेबल हाउसिंग की पॉलिसी की बात कर रहे हैं ना. 2-3 चीजें हैं उसमें. एक सबसे बड़ी चीज है, लोगों को वहां रहना चाहिए जहां उनकी नौकरी है. ये नहीं कि आप उनको सेंटर ऑफ टाउन से निकाल के दहीसर में डाल दें. अब तो दहीसर भी सेंटर हो गया, दहीसर से आगे डाल दें. तो एक तो पॉइंट ये है कि मिक्स्ड लिविंग ही अप्रोच है. नहीं तो भारत में दीवारें बनेंगी जो अभी तक नहीं थी. दूसरी बात यह है कि जितना भी आप बात कर लें, ओनरशिप और रेंटल, वो जो पुरानी बात थी, उसको हम लोगों को थोड़ा सोचना पड़ेगा. एंड रेंटल ऑफर वर्कर्स हैं या जो भी पुअर हैं, वो तो देना ही पड़ेगा. और तीसरी बात यह है कि उस रेंटल ऑफर में एक रास्ता होना चाहिए ओनरशिप की तरफ, कि जैसे आप बढ़ते हैं, जैसे आप और कमाते हैं, आपको फर्स्ट राइट ऑफ रिफ्यूजल होना चाहिए इसको खरीदने के लिए. वहाँ पे इंदिरा गांधी आवास योजना का और व्हाटएवर, जो भी राजीव गांधी आवास योजना, अब जो भी उसका नाम है, दीनदयाल बंधु आवास योजना है, जो भी है, उसका महत्व बहुत ज़्यादा होता है. तो आप सिर्फ कंस्ट्रक्शन वर्कर्स की बात कर रहे हैं, वैसे बहुत लोग हैं जो, हाँ, ऑल ओवर. उसका सोल्यूशन सिर्फ अफोर्डेबल हाउसिंग पॉलिसी में है. Yeah, absolutely.
Can I just add a little bit?
My name is Pratap Chandani from Green Shakti Firm.
Can I, if you don't mind, I just add a little bit to what Ireena has said. See, by definition, urban services are non-exclusive. In a sense, you decide a service, say for water, or a sewerage, or a solid waste management. These are available to all sections of the people. It's not, they don't get designed for unlike a big apartment complex or a car complex. Most of the services get designed for most of the people. And that's the intention. Once you develop the system, you develop a metro system, Metro system is available for everyone. So is a bus rapid transport system or a water supply system. So by definition, most of the urban services will go non-exclusive to all sections of the society without exclusion. Now, there's always a debate in terms of pricing. That's a different call. But having said that, once you start defining, it is meant for everyone, not just a one particular fashion. Unless we develop the basic trunk of getting the services, we'll never be able to reach out to everyone. So that's the reason most planning, when it happens, look at the overall systems and not at a segmented locality. That's how it is normally gets decided.
Yeah, but
So
Raghu,
that should cover.
but I'm not sure I agree with you, because I remember we were doing some work for BMC in slums. And one of the things you realize very quickly is if you don't have an address and you don't have an identity, pani doesn't come to you. So if you look at the really poor in our cities, they actually end up paying much more, whether it is for water or for power or for education. So you need a official identity to access basic citizen services, right? And when I'm living on the road, I don't have that identity. So
That's what I'm trying to differentiate the pricing issue there. To get the service first, then after that, are you eligible to take it in terms of accessing it? That's a different issue. Suppose I don't even have a water to come into that slum, there's no way I'm going to supply. Getting into a household connection or a water supply eligibility for the citizen is different. But if you don't even plan for getting the stuff, suppose you have all the plans ready of getting the services, then it's a question of mechanism to find out how do we distribute amongst various people. Do we have a kind of administrative process to give or not? That's the second challenge. But if you cross the first challenge, automatically second will happen.
Okay, there's one more question.
Yeah, my name is Pratap Chandani from Green Shakti Foundation. You mentioned that cities must do the infrastructure first and then move in the inhabitants. So Greater Noida did that after a lot of study with School of Planning and Architecture, and the city is made out of a textbook almost. I've seen the design manuals, and they've been building it for last 20 years, but it still hasn't, got that buzz. Despite good roads, a lot of green cover, high quality water.
And it's actually a very well designed. It couldn't. One of the hygiene factors is, do I want to live in a city? And Greater Noida, unfortunately, I'm giving you a citizen point of view and investor point of view, so this is a perception, right? This might not be reality. You're scared to invest in that place, right? HR officers get lynched and your wife gets stolen. So I think Noida's problem is not infrastructure. Noida's problem is not recognizing during a plan that this requires to be populated by people. And if I want it to be populated by people, then my proposition to them versus Delhi or Gurgaon has to be viable. And I'm afraid that Noida struggles with safety as an issue both for investors as well as for individual households. Until they address that, it's absolutely terrific infrastructure, but you're not going to see people. At the end of the day, city is about the people.
Noida sees a lot of people. It's Greater
No, I understand. Your point was it doesn't have the buzz, right?
It doesn't. Greater Noida. Noida has.
I understand. But I think you're talking about the place which doesn't have buzz, which has infrastructure but not buzz. And I'm saying buzz is for people. And I'm just giving you a perception. I could be completely wrong, and please forgive me if you're a Greater Noida liver and investor. But that's why people don't go there. Gurgaon actually is worse off in terms of infrastructure than Noida.
Absolutely.
Right? But it's just seen as buzzy.
One more small question. You kept mentioning about collaboration and skill and IIMs and talent. So in terms of your collaboration, do you think talented people in pools, they might be in forms of SMEs or just techies? Okay. And because of this, the way these collaborative agreements are designed, I think they don't provide a safety network for SMEs or innovative companies, smaller companies to really come in and help. They're just not designed like that. It doesn't give that comfort.
The current collaborative frameworks don't. But when I mean collaboration, what I meant was that a city can't function on its own ability to deliver whatever it is. They need different people who are there in various reasons. Various factors have been contributing. So how do we get those people together who are interested? So unless there's a perseverance and the ability to take it through to the end, that is missing. Whatever amount of collaboration or documentation we read is not going to happen. It's a question of do we follow up regularly for everything and with the like-minded people. For instance, why are we sitting here and talking on particular issue? That's because all of us are interested in this and we have something to contribute. And that contribution, apart from this role, I'm sure all of us are going out and trying to do it in their respective lives or the professions or individual capacity. And that is what, when it comes together, will actually happen. So
together, yes, but if you look at it as professionals coming in smaller outfits with some innovation, things that will work from experience overseas and so on, I don't think the ecosystem gives them that safety network to come and contribute, and their ideas would get pinched, IPR would or whatever, and even if you do deliver, there's no guarantee you'll get paid.
I think that connects with what
That's
Ireena had said, that the local employment exchange doesn't necessarily represent the talent that's available.
But the
I
other
mean,
talent
that's
which you
just
said
a metaphor.
why I am so missing,
Yeah.
I'm trying to answer your question.
Right.
There's no comfort level.
Yeah, and this again, we've got to. I mean, one of the spades that we don't call a spade in our country is. I mean, while NOIDA is planned, it may not be planned as well as it could have been planned, and most of our cities suffer from actually planning which is not as sophisticated as it could be. Partly because it's not based on data analysis. It's mostly segregation of land uses. And it's not based on intelligent ideas about how cities ought to be. They're mostly suburbanization plans, actually. So the compact city, the idea of density, of activities, these have not yet, they're creeping in now. And I think the Smart Cities mission will hopefully at least put this on the table as a big issue, that urban form matters. It's not just about drawing the lines and making roads, but how those roads are and how far they are from each other and how many there are and how wide they are matters. And I think that also is about the ecosystem you talk about, finding the space for the SMEs, giving spaces to nurture activities, collaboration, innovation, open spaces, parks where people can sit and discuss ideas. These are not fanciful ideas. This is the DNA of successful cities.
Absolutely.
Sorry, but I just think why Greater Noida doesn't have is probably simply because there's no employment opportunities. That's probably the reason why people don't stay.
It's an integrated model. You have a lot of industries around.
No, in a sense, I had a choice to stay between Greater Noida and Noida. I work in my campus is Amity, so why would I want to drive from Greater Noida to Noida every day? You have the better facility, cheaper facility, probably bigger house, everything. But place of employment happens to be Noida. And that's the way the cities won't happen. Why is Naya Raipur not fully populated than Raipur? Because employment is in Raipur, not in Naya Raipur.
And yet that urban village in Naya Raipur is full of life.
Because you have...
Yeah. So I think we need to end. I'm very, very thankful to both of you for this extremely engaging conversation. And Ireena, Raghu, thank you for your interventions and wonderful sharing of thoughts. I do want to highlight two things which Ireena said, which I think we should take away with us. One, the imperative that we grow smartly. Very essential. And another point about how do we do this in a short period of time. I could not agree more. We don't have time on our side. So every one of these ideas, every one of these questions hopefully becomes part of that Wikipedia. And hopefully we can actually bring all of these questions and answers together using technology, hopefully, and a lot of collaboration. So we can do this at a faster pace as well. So with that, thank you very much, and a very wonderful evening to all of you. Thank you.